So yeah, Wyoming Wildlife Advocates, we're a small organization. We are only I'm the executive director and only employees. So we're small but mighty. We've been around for 5 years now, and we're kind of originally started. A precipitating event happened where a wolf was killed in Grand Teton National Park in one of the park holdings. And this was while wolves were still protected by the Endangered Species Act in Wyoming. And that brought up the issue of who has wildlife management rights on inholdings in the park. And we actually just found out this week that we had lost our appeal. We lost the original case that we brought to make sure that the park had management of those inholdings. But we lost that case, and then we lost our appeal this week, which was a little disappointing, but
Mm,
definitely a fight worth having, and something to bring up. Grand Teton National Park is a really unique park in that it was created very late. It wasn't a full national park until 1950, and there were a
wow.
lot of concessions that were made. There's an airport inside the park.
Right.
There's hunting that goes on in the park in the fall for elk. There's a lot of private in holdings in the park, and there's still, quite a bit of private land that is within the park boundaries. So, yeah, it's just a unique park that way. And
Yeah.
here we see again, that was just kind of another example of some of the jurisdictional, issues that come up in
Right.
in which is Wyoming is a patchwork of federal agencies and state agencies. So it's there's always conflict, I feel like, that happens between who's got jurisdiction over what.
Sure. And you guys came in to take a role to clear those things up and see who's responsible and who really
Yeah,
manages it and
exactly.
how
And
it's
just really,
managed.
yeah, and to be an advocate for the wildlife within the park.
Got it.
It's a unique park in that we do have wolves and grizzly bears, and black bears and mountain lions and coyotes, and then the full suite of ungulates too, moose and elk and deer. So it's a really unique park in that way, that we have these amazing wildlife resources, but it's also a management challenge because the park is only 350,000 acres, which sounds big, but the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem is about 22 million acres together, and so there's a lot of uh, national forest land, that surrounds the parks, and that then even within there you have small state parcels and things like that. So yeah, so we kind of came along and really started taking up like these orphan issues that really nobody else was talking about at the time. Issues of grizzly bear hunting and wolf hunting in Wyoming, and also chronic wasting disease, which is really threatening our elk herds here. So, kind of taking on the issues that were more controversial and other people maybe didn't feel comfortable,
Sure.
speaking out against. And we really we tried to remain small, nimble, adaptive, and kind of just ready to take on issues as they come up. But yeah, our main focus is really just preventing trophy hunting of grizzlies and wolves, and also making sure that our elk, which is a big part of the biomass here
Right.
in the Yellowstone ecosystem, is protected, especially from this chronic wasting disease, which could really devastate our elk herds.
Wow. So that's, are you focused in specific geographical areas, more in the national parks or all of Wyoming?
We
I'm assuming most of the animals are around the parks, and that's where your highest concentration is, in and around the
Yeah,
park.
I mean, we are a statewide organization, but just because, yes, you're right. There's most of the wildlife is concentrated within the parks, like that's kind of the core area, and then the
Yeah.
surrounding national forest and BLM. And but yeah, we take on issues. There's Thunder Basin National Grassland in the eastern part of the state. There's other national monuments around the state. So we don't just focus on public lands, though. We're also focused on wildlife wherever it may be in Wyoming.
Got it. And thank you. That's such an amazing thing that you're taking on. So, what are some of the biggest challenges? Maybe we can break it down by species because it's probably not the same for all of them. Maybe grizzly bear, elk, and wolves. What are some of the main threats to their existence right now that you guys are fighting for?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Wyoming has a history of oil and gas development, and that's, one of the main, it's the biggest contributor to the economy.
Mhm.
Which, when you have species like sage grouse and pronghorn that are reliant upon sagebrush habitat, that oil and gas development can be really disruptive to them, and so we're always keeping an eye on those things. There are a lot of wildlife focused organizations in the state, but they focus mostly on ungulates, so elk and deer. Um,
Okay.
those are like kind of the more valued species in Wyoming, I would say, because they do hold monetary value for hunting licenses. Whereas like
Sure.
your carnivores, your grizzly bears and wolves and mountain lions and things like that are less valued, I would say. Just in general, from a state perspective. So
Yeah.
um, oh, we really are here to, like, wildlife management and in views of wildlife is really shifting in the United States. We kind of, as westward expansion was happening, people had a much more doministic view of wildlife, like,
Hmm.
humans are over wildlife, and we're over the natural world, and we're going to come in and kind of like tame this, this wild place that is the West. But now we're starting to see this shift where people are starting to realize that people are part of ecosystems, and we are just on the same level as those wildlife species. Like, we all have a right to exist here, and
Yeah.
how can we coexist more together rather than just pushing a species aside? So, and one of the big things that does come up a lot, we are absolutely not an anti-hunting organization. We have supporters. We have a board member who's a hunter, and if hunting elk and deer meat is a great way to feed your family, in a very economical way. It's lean meat. It's healthy. It hasn't been raised on a factory farm. We're all for that. But when it comes to hunting species like grizzly bears and coyotes and wolves, they're not ungulates. They're not herding animals. They need to be treated in a different way. And there's sort of this like ingrained thought process that like hunting, conservation cannot happen without hunting. And what we're
Yeah.
finding is, like, when you have predator populations or carnivore populations, if you don't hunt them, they will self-regulate. Like, there's this, I think, myth that people have that they will just eat every elk and deer that's out there. That's just not
Right.
true. Like, we've seen like living proof of this. And if you look at like a place like Isle Royale, where you have moose and wolves together, like, the wolves went extinct over time, like
Yeah.
on the island again, they were extirpated.
That's
um
because the deer and elk aren't pumped full of sodium and sugar, so they're not as addictive as our, our human food.
exactly. So, we just there is really no reason to hunt grizzly bears or wolves. There's not.
Yeah.
We don't need to control their populations. They will do that on their own. And, certainly we can reduce conflicts using other methods, because, it's naive to think that there's not going to be conflicts as wolves and bears spread out in their
Sure.
habitat in your native area. But we as humans are we should be the smarter species, and
Right.
and use our big brains to help us solve these problems. A bear is going to be a bear no matter what. It's driven by its instincts, and we have the power to do things differently. And so, we really should try to do that if we can, and make it
Yeah.
so that, that we can live alongside them rather than, like, just wiping them out everywhere we go.
And how does the Wyoming, I guess maybe state governments think about the tourism dollars that come in because of Yellowstone and expanding the areas that people are coming to visit instead of crowding everyone in? Because if it's purely financially driven, I would think that expanding more on the tourism and using uh, these tourism dollars to grow areas and expanding and like is that helping change the mindset of the locals or the government that this is something to be preserved and expanded, or is that still a struggle?
It's still a struggle. One of the things about Wyoming is that the state was built upon oil and gas development and ranching, and so those are the two big industries that, and actually, ranching is no longer a really large economic contributor to the state. However, They still hold a lot of political power and
Sure.
financial power. Oil and gas obviously has a lot of financial backing and a lot of money and political power behind them. Um, that's kind of been our argument, is that we have this like golden goose kind of situation, and Jackson is looked at in a very, if you go anywhere else in Wyoming and you say you're from Jackson,
Yeah.
you're going to be met with a kind of a bit of a different vibe
A
than
little
if you
different than Cody.
from. Exactly. So we're kind of seen as the New York or or hoity-toity area of Wyoming, and that we're not really Wyomingites. However, the prosperity that has been enjoyed here can be extended to other parts in the state. Like Lander is a great
Absolutely.
place, and Sheridan. I mean, if there was a robust wolf population in either of those places, there would be wolf
Yeah.
watchers there.
Right.
So people, yeah, I mean, look at the amount of people that come to Yellowstone National Park. I mean, we're talking 7 million visitors a year between Yellowstone and Grand Teton. And the number one thing that people want to see is a grizzly bear and wolves. I mean,
Right.
that's driving the tourism here. And so the state is just really still stuck in kind of this very like 1800s mindset of that, like, we still have ranching here, and that's our mainstay. And there's still just this really deep-seated cultural hatred of native carnivores like wolves and bears.
Hmm.
And I think that that's just going to be a generational shift over
Sure.
time that will have to occur to really help people to understand how beneficial these animals are to the ecosystems,
Right.
and how beneficial they can be to the economies too of small towns especially.
Yeah, we almost need to look at like Africa in a way and think of Wyoming as safaris. I mean, imagine opening up some of those grasslands during the antelope migration and seeing the wolf hunts going on that naturally did before, and being able to and we have it all. We have all of it here. It's just, there's so much of it in private hands. If there was a way to try to shift that economy back into the private, where the private landowners, they uh, thrive from the tourist economy. And, maybe those are just some of the initiatives that they just take time. And people like you are taking
Mhm.
the, that message and hopefully, changing some minds. So what are some specific uh, types of advocacy examples that you could give us that you're doing on a daily basis or weekly or annual campaigns and stuff?
Sure. Yeah. One of the big things we do is actually protest against trophy hunting. They're really, we're we're in the 21st century now, and we know that animals have intrinsic value, and that animals also have value to the ecosystem, and that every piece and part of the ecosystem is necessary. And to
Yeah.
have people on the landscape who are just killing these animals just to hang a head on their wall or a hide on the floor is, we're just beyond that at this point, as a
Right.
human species, and as people who care about the environment and care about this planet that we're living on. And we know that whatever happens to animals will eventually happen to people too.
Yeah.
We're all connected, and we know that. So um to getting rid of kind of, once again, just like cultural uh, myths and misinformation, that's another thing we do, is just try to educate a lot. There's so many myths and misinformation out there, especially about wolves. It's funny because grizzly bears, people tend to like grizzly bears in general. Like even
Hmm.
ranchers, can learn to kind of like get along with them and appreciate them on the landscape. But when it comes to wolves, it is the most contentious, hot button issue you can ever like. If you walked into Casper, into a bar in Casper and yelled, "I love wolves," you're gonna be like stoned to death. So
Yeah.
it's still just that's a hard thing to overcome in the state, is just the stigma against this species. They're seen as these bloodthirsty killers that just kill for fun, and they'll wipe out all the elk and things like that. And there's zero evidence to back any of that up, and
Yeah.
that it's just still kind of like hanging out there. So we do spend a lot of time educating the public about the threats that wildlife are facing, and the fact that, like, a lot of people come to the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem and see this place as like a wildlife paradise. I mean, it looks on the surface like, yeah, it's a totally healthy, functioning ecosystems, but if you scratch a little bit beyond the surface and you look a little deeper, you'll see that there are actually some bigger problems here that the ecosystems are having, and that,
Hmm.
some of our, like, our elk population is actually pretty sick. And our deer population is declining as well. So, we
Right.
have these issues that are kind of going on, and people just don't know about them. So we spend a lot of time educating, and then also, talking to elected officials and trying to get them to either introduce legislation, or when state agencies have public comment opportunities, we let the public know that, so they can comment on those things as well, and then we always send comments in. I'm a little bit disheartened at this point with that process, because so much of the time we spend a lot of time writing public comments, and
Right.
it's not that they're ignored. It's just there's sort of like a predetermined outcome a lot of times on those things. And I would just say, if anybody is, like, if you're interested in getting involved, like, handwriting a letter, or like actually getting on the phone and talking to a legislator, is probably those are probably like the two best ways to reach an elected official. A form
Okay.
letter or like a petition just doesn't. It may be different in other states, but here in Wyoming, the legislators have made it very clear that they don't want a form letter. They don't want to see just a signature on a list. They want
Right.
to hear from
Okay.
the people.
That's a really great call to action, because that was I had that as one of my takeaways. Is like, what can we do if you're listening to this and you're feeling empowered to take action? What are some of the things they could do? And could that be done by even as a visitor to the area, anyone, or do you have to be a Wyoming resident to be able to take action? I assume, letting them know opinion in a handwritten letter. It doesn't matter where it's coming from, as long as it's honest uh, and thoughtful, that it still makes an impact.
Yeah, I would say that a handwritten letter from anywhere would be great, especially if you say that, you come to the state and spend your tourist dollars here, and that you're
Right.
supportive of, the local economies. Most people drive to Wyoming. It's we do have one airport in Jackson, but getting to Yellowstone, most people are driving, and so they're driving across to Wyoming
Yep.
and spending money in state, Lander and Casper and Cheyenne and places along the
Pinedale.
way.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, yeah, I mean, you do have power, even if as a non-resident. Obviously, residents are going to be listened to. I guess would have a little bit more weight behind what they're saying. So, if
Sure.
you are a Wyoming resident and you are listening to this, it would be great to contact the governor. Like, write him a letter, or your local legislator, and just let them know how you feel and that you want to see protection for some of our animals, especially our native carnivores, which don't have much protection at this point.
And for those listening that think that, the impact of wolves, I've found that visiting Yellowstone, the wolf project that's been happening there, it's been so incredible to see the number of species that it impacts. Uh, that the elk stop overgrazing around the river, and the trees grow, larger, and they create shade. So there's cooler spots in the water, and then all of a sudden the fish come back that weren't there before. So it's such a larger cycle than just the wolf, and how it creates
Exactly. I mean,
the right balance.
yeah, that trophic cascade really is important in ecosystems, and we've seen now, like, what it looks like to not have it there, and
Yeah.
to have that keystone species there, and then to have them back again, and to see the effects of it. And I say that anybody that loves elk should love wolves too, because they keep herds healthier and more robust. Doug Smith, one of the main researchers in Yellowstone, who's worked on wolves for decades now, has seen that. He said when he first started doing research in Yellowstone, he would see elk limping, and would see kind of sickly elk on the landscape. And now he just doesn't see that. They get picked off. Those are the ones that are not going to make it. That's just part of
Yeah.
natural selection. So, having wolves present with elk is really important to keep those herds, to keep disease at bay, and to make sure that, like, the healthiest ones are the ones that are passing down their genetics.
Not be couch potato elk.
Exactly. There's no, you cannot be a couch potato elk. You won't make it very long.
We could use a couple of wolves in the human species.
Exactly.
Well, thank you. And then, to find more information, Wyoming Wildlife Advocates.org, is that the best place to stay up to date on all the initiatives that you guys are fighting and things that you're
Yeah,
working on so that, the audience could also take action on those, your priorities and be aligned?
sure. Yeah, check out our website and our Facebook and Instagram. I usually post pretty frequently on those sites, just to keep, about current news that's going on here in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and across Wyoming as well.
Yeah, I really like your Instagram. It was really informative, and I love what you guys are doing with interviewing people and getting their feedback. It was really cool.
Nice, thanks. Yeah, I mean, we love to hear from people. People, wildlife management and really wildlife advocacy is not about wildlife. It's about people. And that's something that surprised me is being a wildlife advocate is that, I mean, of course I went to school, and studied biology and environmental science and and I never thought I would be involved in like social sciences. But
Right.
as I'm getting more and more deeper into this field, it actually, the psychology and the social sciences behind decisions that people make and actions that people take are really more and more intriguing to me because that's what's really driving either harm to wildlife or what makes people want to help wildlife as well.
Yeah, and that's where you can make the true impact is by understanding the people side of things. And it's so funny that you say that. Is we work with stray dogs in India. We've been doing, my wife and I, when we go visit, we do a lot of work there, and it always makes me realize that there's not a stray dog problem. It's a human problem, and these are human
Exactly.
issues that we have to solve. The dogs aren't just a byproduct of the way our lifestyle is and our behaviors are towards them. So it's funny to see that it's the same with
Exactly.
wildlife. Yeah, wildlife just
Hmm.
wants to exist, right? So it's just how
They're
we
just going to do
interact
what
with it.
they're going to do. Yeah, like
Yeah,
we humans are the ones that change the game on them all the time.
yeah. Are you one thing that's been kind of concerning to me lately is human interaction with wildlife in national parks? Is that still a growing concern, or are you guys doing anything with that, or is that all up to the national park to, just seeing like concerning YouTube videos where somebody tries to ride a buffalo and it gets 6 million views, and all of a sudden it's the top ranking video on YouTube. Like, how is that? Um, Whether it's the social media impact and or increased visitation to the park, is that a concern to wildlife, disturbing them, or when you consider it across all the different things that it's just gets blown up on social media and it's not as big of an issue?
Yeah, the park service spends an enormous amount of time trying to educate visitors that come to the park about
Yeah,
being safe around wildlife and being respectful in your interactions with wildlife. Unfortunately, I mean, we still have people that feed bears sometimes in Grand Teton National Park, and they have to be usually euthanized because of
the
that.
people, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, unfortunately, the bears are the ones that always
Unfortunately.
pay the price.
Yeah,
When it comes to bison, usually the humans are the ones that do pay the price because there's
yeah,
not a lot that can hurt a 2,000 pound bison.
yeah,
um, you know, and the interesting thing that like has been really noted is that it's you. I don't. People are still going to do it, and I think that Yellowstone. I've heard from like the superintendent up there. I mean, he's frustrated. It's like, how much can we tell people, don't sit on the bison, don't touch the bison, and yet people are still going to do it. And so I think they're kind of at a loss a little bit
hmm
of, how do we mitigate this risk when we have wild animals and people, but at the same time, like, how are we? You can't force it down people's throats as much as you try. And I think
yeah,
some of it has to do with the fact that we're like becoming a more of an urbanized society, and people just don't have as much like chance to interact with wildlife as much as they used to. And so I think when people see a wild animal, it doesn't maybe register in their mind of like, okay, I'm going to interact with this animal for 5 to 10 minutes, but the impacts may be for an entire day or a month, or, this could impact this animal for the rest of its life.
yeah. That's
And
so interesting that you say that. That I learned that if you're close enough, or if you're doing something to change the behavior of the animal that it's doing in the moment, the impact. It could be resting when it needs to rest, and if you agitate it and move it, then it can't get its rest, and it could cause pregnancy issues. It could cause all kinds of behavioral issues. Um, and I feel like people mean well, so maybe we'll take this back. We're going to definitely write content about this and do more education around the fact that if you're close enough to change the animal's behavior, you're too close. You have, and it's coming from a place where I feel like most people love animals and they want to interact with them because out of that love and compassion, they probably want to treat them as dogs and pet them.
Mhm.
Who knows? But there's larger impact than after you drive away. That animal is disturbed. They can't exist the way it was going to, and they're just and maybe it wasn't an issue 10 years ago when there wasn't as much visitation, but now it's a whole different problem where we just have such an increased attendance at these parks that these are new issues that we have to handle. So
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, part of it is just a factor that we're seeing so much more, such a greater increase in visitation and more people getting outside. I mean, the pandemic has definitely just accelerated that, tenfold. Like I said, we really saw that here and around the parks. And I mean, Yellowstone had its busiest October ever. And October is usually an off-season month for us here.
wow.
So people are they are getting out. And I think you're right. Like, people have good intentions. They want to interact with the animals because they love them and they're excited to see them. But we also need to recognize that we are one human of many, many, many humans. And whatever you do, there's probably 50 other people that might do the same thing. And that cumulative effect, that's really what we're seeing, is just the cumulative effect of interaction after interaction after interaction. And sometimes that can lead to like habituation for certain species. For instance, here in Jackson, on the backside of the elk refuge, there's a road and there are bighorn sheep that spend the winter on Miller Butte. I mean, you can drive right up to them and, they're just hanging out on the side of the road. They're pretty habituated at this point to people. People even bike and walk on the road, and the sheep are pretty much, just, they don't really mind, or they're not really bothered at all. But, if somebody were to step off the road and head toward those sheep, then,
Yeah.
that would be a really big impact that, may impact that particular animal or even the species as a whole. And, not only are you impacting the species, but you might also be impacting other people's enjoyment of the animals as well.
Yeah.
Just this
Yeah,
past
that's
week,
absolutely right.
and just this past weekend, there was a video that came out of some people who were incredibly close to 3 bull moose. They were pretty small bull moose. They weren't, they didn't have gigantic racks, but a bull moose is a bull moose. And no matter how
Right.
small it is, it's still a big animal that could trample you. And these people were so close to these, they were actually sparring with each other. Um, and it may seem like, oh, okay, I'm not having an impact on the animal, but you're right. If you were causing the animal to do anything other than what it would normally do, then you are impacting it. And I think there's a spectrum. Like, no matter what you're doing outside, if you're near wildlife, you're having an impact, and
Yeah.
there's a spectrum of impact there.
Sure.
We're finding, and research is finding now, that things that are faster and mechanized are the things that are really disruptive to wildlife,
Okay.
especially bigger wildlife like grizzly bears, um,
Mm-hmm.
ATVs and snowmobiles and things like that. Even mountain bikes have become kind of a hot button issue too, because we're starting to see that wildlife really tend to avoid areas where there are mountain bikes, especially close to the trails. And you know um the the species, so you're having some kind of impact, even if you're just a person out there walking, you may
Yeah.
be disturbing that animal a little bit, but the impacts are fewer and shorter lived when it's just kind of a person doing something, rather than like a person plus some kind of a machine or something. And
Sure.
it really seems to be a factor too that we're finding now, that impacts animals greater while you're at high speeds, and then also that impact tends to last longer as well.
Okay. That's a really good point. I think that's where we wanted to talk about transitioning to our next question is, what is outdoor recreation's role and its impact on wildlife, whether it's positive or negative. And what can the outdoor industry do to support and coexist with this wildlife? Is it, and I'm sure it's so regional. Um, there where you have issues, you're not going to have issues in Moab or Sedona with some of these species because you're up on a rock. But in some of these wooded areas and during some of the peak seasons, uh, I guess it could be a really long list. But let's talk about some of the activities. Skiing, mountain biking. We intentionally don't have 4x4s, ATVs, or any kind of motorized equipment on our website for that reason, because it's speed, pollution, and noise factors. And we really believe in getting people active. But I personally have had interactions with wildlife that were a little too close of a call, and I didn't feel comfortable with that. Not from my point of view, but realizing that there's 100 other mountain bikers on the trail with me. And I'm sure it's not a popular topic, but there's probably a way to mitigate, minimize our impact during our recreation time. And what are some of the studies finding, or how can we better interact? Is it dedicated areas for recreation? Are those better? Um, is there any data around that, or science that's finding how can recreation play a role into preserving and working and coexisting with wildlife?
Yeah, I mean, recreationists can 100% be conservationists. And, you know, like I said, there is a spectrum of use, and we need to just all realize that when we are out there, we are having an impact. I mean, I hike with my dog, and research has shown that dogs, even just on a trail, wildlife react to the smell and the sound and are going to be pushed further away from those trails just by the presence of a dog being there.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't think any of us that are outside can act like we don't have, we have zero impact. It's just not true. And so we really want to, I think every person needs to look at it for themselves and also do some research before you go to a place. Find out what are the species that are struggling there, and are there already laws or some kind of guidelines or rules in place to protect these species.
Sure.
One really good example is that bighorn sheep in the Tetons. There's a very specific, very small population of bighorn sheep in the Teton Mountain Range. They are completely isolated. They don't migrate anymore because their migration routes have been cut off. There's only about 80 animals left. So 50 to 80 animals is the current estimate. Now, backcountry skiing has become very, very popular in Grand Teton National Park. And there are places. So what happened was the government agencies went, they mapped out areas of where the sheep are found. They mapped out areas where bighorn sheep habitat is really important. And then also sent GPS devices up with skiers to see where are the most popular ski routes and where are people really being found in the wintertime. Now, there's very clear areas where there's overlap where skiers are found, and it's really key habitat for bighorn sheep. In those areas, I think we need to look at the personal responsibility. Like, do you as a human want to be a part of something that may be responsible for the extirpation of a very unique species? Like, we do live on this earth with other things, and
Yeah.
I think we all really need to think about what is our own personal impact. How do we feel about that? And how can we minimize that? Like you said, if there are designated areas where uh, recreation has already been set aside for, we were like, okay, this area is going to be for mountain biking, so this is where we're going to go. But pushing these limits and like opening up more and more and more habitat to, more and more and more recreation. I mean, part of it, if you really go back to it and look at it on the underneath side, it's just that there are so many humans.
Yeah.
We there's a lot of us out there. And so
Yeah.
if there were 10 people and you had 100,000 acres, there probably isn't going to be much of an impact. But now if you have 1 million people in those same 100,000 acres, you're going to have an impact. And as outdoor recreation, our gear is getting better. It's allowing us to stay out longer and to go further and higher and do more, which is great. Like I want to encourage, we certainly want to encourage people to get out and interact with nature. And we know that nature has so many healing properties for humans. But at the same time, we also just need to remember that there are other species living on this planet that also have a home, and that is their home. Like you perhaps getting, a day's worth of skiing in, is that worth it, that you are going to deprive an animal of their home?
Right.
Or if that mountain bike ride that you're going to go on, is that worth it, that you're going to disrupt an animal and they may never be there again?
Right.
So I think that each
But
person just kind of has to like look within themselves and really think about that, and think about how they feel about it. And do you want to be a contributing member of conservation toward these areas so that we have them for future generations, or do you want to be a part of the problem?
right. And how was, as you're traveling around, and maybe in our case, maybe a lot of people travel to new destinations. Um, is there a national voice for these um, areas that says like, hey, this is a critical habitat, and that we can kind of point people to, or is it all pretty bifurcated and spread out between, states, like organizations like yours trying to make the impact in small individual places? Like, what's the best way for someone to do that research and see what, hey, I'm going mountain biking here, I'm going backcountry skiing here, what's the impact? um, but what are the best practices on like how to go search for that?
That's a good question. I mean, unfortunately, I wish there was kind of a centralized database of that information, but I don't think there is. I think it is more small local organizations that are focused on specific species, like grizzly bears, Canada lynx, black-footed ferret, the desert tortoise, all those species that are kind of struggling. And I think, those are probably, it's not that other species don't also matter, but I think to be particularly aware of if there is a species that's kind of hanging on by a thread,
Yeah.
um, like the desert tortoise, for example, they're just running out of room to be able to exist. And so just being extra mindful of where you're recreating, and with the impact that you're having on their habitat is really important. I think, before you go somewhere, check and see if there are any local wildlife nonprofits and what kind of work they do. And usually most national parks have really good information on their websites about
Sure.
different species that may be endangered or threatened in in the park boundaries, and in the surrounding habitat as well. So I think it's just a matter of, yeah, just doing a little research and finding out ahead of time. And then also just, I don't know, maybe not pushing it further than you think you should. I think that
Yeah.
uh, there just needs to be places for animals to exist that are not impacted by humans. And
Sure.
we if we're gonna have those species here, they just need that kind of area,
Yeah.
especially the
So to
bigger species.
really, on that spectrum, I suppose if you're going out and you're taking a trip to Jackson, or you're going to some of these really remote wilderness outdoor areas, but there's dense population of wildlife, uh, I would say first, if you can avoid a snowmobile tour, try snowshoeing, avoid a four wheeler and try hiking, or another activity that is still going to give you the adrenaline rush, still going to give you the enjoyment, but it's not as impactful. And uh, I would say like just make your way down that path of like, okay, what's the next thing that I can do? And it's different for everyone. I feel like, for somebody that's hiking, how can I maybe hike quietly or not play music out loud? Um, and that could be a very small thing that could have an impact. And I think you said it perfectly, that we all have to look at ourselves and say, where am I and how can I get a little bit better, so maybe my kids can see this same thing and enjoy it the same way I'm enjoying it today. Because I think we all, again, I think we mean well. We want to go to these places that are really remote, but do we want to stop that at our generation, or do we want to maybe pass that on for just even one more generation? At this rate, that would be even a huge win. So
Hmm. Yeah, you're right. I mean, if it's kind of sad to think about, like, our kids and or their, our children's children, will they have the same access that we do to these untouched places? And we know how healing that is for humans to be out in that. And so, yeah, it's really sad to think about depriving future generations of that, for sure.
yeah. Well, thank you so much, Kristen. Is there anything that you feel like we haven't covered, or some issues um, that you'd like to share or leave people with?
Um, I think really the message I want to drive home. We certainly don't want to be preachy, or I mean, we don't want to preach to the choir because those people are already on board. We just really want to educate people about thinking a little bit outside of yourself, and just recognizing that you're a piece of something much larger. And unfortunately, there are a lot of humans, and we're squeezing these places more and more and more. The Gritty Yellowstone ecosystem is a great example of that. Like, we can either make this a place of a shining example of how to coexist with wildlife and to be able to interact with nature in positive ways where it doesn't impact nature as much, or we can just keep pushing and pushing and pushing and squeezing it more and more and more until finally it's gone. And unfortunately, when these wild places go, it's really difficult to get them back. It takes decades to get that natural state back in order. And humans are a part of the ecosystem. We are not separate from it. We're dependent upon it, as much as you may not seem like that in your daily life, but we are. And so, yeah, I think just each person just really needs to think about what does it mean to them to be able to get out in that nature, and do you want to make sure that that's there and really do something to protect it. I've spoken with several local conservationists who have done this for 40, 50 years, and the one thing that I heard over and over from them is that recreationists used to be the loudest voices for protecting wildlife and wilderness. And they feel like that has changed a little bit. And, I don't, that's not to blame people. I just want to offer that perspective of somebody that has been around and done this for a while. They're starting to realize that, like, people have become a little bit selfish. And it seems like, what's in this for me is somehow the only thing that people think. So, if you do care about nature and you enjoy recreating out there, I would just say get involved somehow, whether that's speaking up, contacting your legislators, really doing, donating to a nonprofit that helps to protect wild places and wildlife. There's many things you can do. Just give back somehow if you enjoy being out there as well, because it's really up to all of us. It's no
Yeah.
one's coming no one's coming to help us. We got to do this ourselves. So,
Yeah.
and it excites me to think about recreationists once again being this, like, really strong voice for conservation, um like blazing a path for, here's how we do this, and here's how we interact with nature as a human species, in the correct way, so that nature is not hurt by it, but that we are enhancing it somehow.
Well, that gives me a lot of hope because it's good to hear that, 40 or 50 years ago that the recreationalists were the voice and they were leading the charge. And hopefully we can do a small part in taking that back and, may, going back to those things that are selfless. Because what we all love about recreating in nature is the nature itself. And that's maybe just a reminder, that small reminder is what we're out here for is what we love is what we want to preserve and not love it to death. For anyone listening, I absolutely loved Wyoming Wildlife Advocates.org's wildlife guide. So please go check that out. It is super adorable. The hand drawn animals, it seems like, and, listen to, subscribe to their email newsletter, learn about topics that are coming up. And if you're in Wyoming and in Yellowstone and find yourself enjoying the wildlife around you, just know that there's people like Kristen behind the scenes working every day, working hard to preserve this for us. So please go on, support their work, write that handwritten letter. I know we will, and donate to them. And again, just be aware of your impact and where you're recreating and get outside as much as possible, because if you don't love nature, you're definitely not going to work towards preserving it. But when you're out recreating in nature, please do be a little bit more mindful.